Great. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of IRADe, I welcome you all to the webinar on net zero strategies for India's power sector. We have some engaging sessions lined up today with participation from distinguished policymakers and energy sector experts from India and across the globe. We will also be presenting the findings of IRADE's study on developing net zero strategies for the Indian power sector. For your information, please, this webinar is being recorded. As we begin, I would request Dr. Jyoti Parekh to kindly welcome the delegates. Dr. Jyoti Parekh is the Executive Director of IRADE. She was the member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change and was also a recipient of Nobel Peace Prize awarded to IPCC authors in 2007. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Rima. I welcome all the panelists and delegates who are attending. Thank you for being with us. We wish to get your feedback on our net zero emissions exercise for the electricity sector that we have done. Such a debate has to recognize multiple factors. First of all, on one hand, India is seen as the fourth largest or third largest emitter, if you count, don't count EU, due to delayed development. It is among the lowest in per capita terms, less than half of world average. India has lost its carbon space to other growing or already grown countries, with very little room left to grow. For example, cumulated emissions from 1990 to 2020 period for China and USA are 180 gigatons and 160 gigatons respectively, as against India's 40 gigatons. What is more, these countries are now even claiming substantial future carbon space through their net zero strategies, stretching up to 2016. While we think expecting net zero goals across the board without the discussion on fair carbon budget is not correct, we also believe that India should engage in this debate and see what problems we have to surmount for the future pathways for the net zero goal, and what would it involve, what do we have to do for it, what are the investments needed, what technology mix is needed. Second, we believe that Paris Agreement is a good prescription for lowering emissions every decade. It is a wiser course than miraculously arriving at net zero after emitting a lot. This needs to be followed immediately by all countries whose emissions are higher than global per capita average, approximately 4.5 tons. India is about 2 tons or so. So third, coming to India, it started following Paris Agreement earnestly. We have to reach its NDC goals. For example, large majority of states in India have reached 36% of non-fossil capacity, and the central entities such as NTPC, GAIL, of course, nuclear and NHPC are together not yet 38%, but they would be even perhaps 50% by the time 2030 because they have very aggressive and concrete plans to put up renewable energy during this period. Recently, our corporate sector is also outdoing one another in putting up solar panel installation and manufacturing and declaring net zero goals in a decade or so. It includes large global enterprises such as Reliance, Adani, Tata, BSP Solar, BP Solar, as well as small and medium scale firms. Thus, India's march to low carbon pathway is systematic, active, and inclusive of state, center, and corporate sector. I should also mention that India is doing a huge adaptation burden every year, and now almost every week there is some kind of major happening, such as cyclones, floods, and so on. And every week you hear enormous amount of loss and damage. Our demand has been, fourth is the Indian population is paying huge amount of fossil fuel taxes when they use LPG, diesel, petrol, or coal-based electricity. which has rupees 400 cess or tax per ton of coal, and highest coal transportation surcharge compared to any other commodity by railways. Fifth is our demand has been low. Currently, there are only 29 cars per thousand as against more than 700 per thousand in the United States, or even China has many more. But the new stock is likely to be electric or highly efficient, for example, with the Bharat Standard BS6 and so on. India can therefore leapfrog and avail latecomers' advantage and contain its future emissions in all sectors. So today, with these considerations, we present you IRADe model results that show pathways for the power sector to 2050 and 2060. We have chosen to first model only the power sector because electrification is the way to net zero, which would be the case for transportation, cooking, space heating, and so on. And so it would cover quite much more than 50% in future. And we need to ensure both megawatt and megawatt hour balances throughout this period. Our approach depends on three key assumptions, as do most other researchers. Final demand of electricity in terms of energy and power that we assume, and they will make it that explicit. Second, potential is a potential or upper limits of each technology by time period, and the third is cost of each technology by time. So how the cost curve drops for renewable and increases for coal, or what are the upper limits for renewable, all that will be kept in view while we model. Some other works for net zero models are also available for energy needs, but we not only have energy balance, but power balance to ensure electricity is available for all 24 hours by assuming 12 daily load curves, one for each month and for 24 hours a day. This captures the seasonal as well as daily variations across the year, mindful of the non-availability of solar other than the 8 hours, as well as mindful of the demand, which is not there, which is much less during the night time and so on. So it is not enough to do kilowatt hour energy balance as many times people do. That is to say, we consider each technology mix with its own limitations and with its potential. This important exercise can certainly benefit from multiple approaches, and many teams should do that. We hope to benefit from the inputs of the decision makers, panelists, and other experts in the audience. And I thank all of you for being with us and the IRADe team who has also worked hard. We are sorry that some of the minister could not come, R.K. Singh, after he confirmed, because today, and some other participants along with him, because today Prime Minister has had a cabinet meeting, perhaps to discuss this very same subject. He might even go, we don't know. So I apologize for that, but we hope to have enough discussion from you. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your informative address. I would now request Dr. Kirit Parekh, sir, to present the policy implications of IRADe's study on developing net zero strategies for the Indian power sector. Dr. Kirit Parekh is the chairman of IRADe and former member, Planning Commission, Government of India. Dr. Parekh was also honored with Padma Bhushan by the President of India in March 2009. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Nick, are you here? Nick's turn? Okay, then I begin. I will share my screen and show my presentation here. Can you see this?
And,
Is this visible?
Nick,
Not yet, sir.
Not yet.
It's now visible. Hello?
No, sir, we can't see that.
Okay. Screen sharing failed to start.
So can I do it on your behalf?
Yeah, please put on the screen.
Yeah, okay, sir.
Nick came on and you went away, I think. He said I'll be back in a minute.
Screen sharing failed to start. Okay.
So can I do it on your behalf?
Yeah,
No,
please put on the screen.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's on.
So is it clear now, sir? Can you see the screen? Right.
Let me start. It's attaining net zero for India's power sector. We are examine the technology and cost implication. Go to the next one, please. Next one. Screen sharing failed to start. Our approach is.
So can I do it on your behalf?
Yeah, please put on the screen.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's on.
So is it clear now, sir? Can you see the screen? Right.
Let me start. It's attaining net zero for India's power sector. We are examine the technology and cost implication. This is coming from the record. Next one, please. Next one. Power sector sharing failed to start. Our approach is. Okay.
So
I think we need to sort this out. It's attaining net zero for India's power sector. We are examine the technology and cost implication. This is coming from the recording. Next one, please. Shall I go ahead with? I mean, it's not my voice that is coming. Screen sharing failed to start. Our approach is.
So
I think we need to sort this out.
Can you check if you are logged in with twice?
Sir, can you see the screen?
I can see. I don't know. This is coming from the recording. Next one, please. Shall I go ahead with?
Yes, sir. Please carry on.
My voice that is coming. Power sector. This is coming from a recording. I'm not speaking at the moment. Sort this out.
Can you check if you are logged in with twice?
Sir, can you see the screen?
I can see. I don't know. Yeah, but.
Sharmishta, request all to be mute.
Yes. Yes, sir. Please carry on.
My voice that is coming. Power sector. This is coming out. I'm not speaking at the moment. Sort this out.
Can you check if you are logged in with twice?
Please turn off all your mics.
Everybody should turn off their mic.
Sir, can you see the screen?
I can see. I don't know. Yes, we can see this.
Sharmishta,
Yes, please.
request all to be mute.
Yes. Yes, I think we can carry on. I've stopped the live streaming. There is some problem. There's a constant echo.
Yeah, okay. Can you please put the second slide?
Yes.
What is this? Yeah, okay. Can you put the second slide approach? Is this fine? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Previous one.
It's very good now. Just continue.
We have, no, go to the previous one.
Okay.
Okay, we have done it for power sector as Jyoti explained. I think this is the critical sector and we must first get it net zero for the power sector. Next. And our approach has been, next slide, please. Sarmishta, next slide.
Yes, sir. It's getting stuck here. 1 second, please. Yes.
Our approach is to use the message model, which has the present discounted cost minimizing multi-period optimizing model. And the cost that includes our investment, fixed operating charges, fuel cost, etc. We have used various technology alternatives and we have used demand is specified exogenously, and hourly demand for a typical day for each month specified, as we said. I mean, as was pointed out, peak capacity and energy demand supply balance are every hour up. Next. Next slide, please.
Yes, sir. I don't know, there is some problem here. It's not going down. Yes.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Next, please. Yeah, I think technologies we have considered mainly are the nuclear, solar PV, wind onshore, wind offshore, storage for hydro, pump storage, CSS, and of course, all the conventional coal and gas and other things. Now, hydrogen is not considered because its main role is in transport, and we haven't used it for this purpose here because it will, and this shows the kind of potential limits we have assumed and the cost reductions we have assumed for these technologies. Next, please. Next slide.
Yes, sir. 1 second. This is the problem here. Sorry. Yes, please.
Now, you know, this is your jump too fast. But anyway, we have looked at the additional investment cost for getting net zero by 2050 or 2060. And you can see this is compared over the bow scenario. Why is this blacked out? And in the decade of 30s, we will need some $600 billion US per decade. Then it will be, if it's delayed, of course, we will need less. And the model results show that net zero earlier, 2050, is costlier than if it was in 2060. And one can emphasize the cost is just for power sector. And many costs are not included, like what is the cost of low PLF for coal power, which increases its operating cost and reduces its lifetime and so on. And also, if the coal minings have to be closed down, a rehabilitation cost and loss of employment has to be included in this. And finally, I think adaptation and loss and damage, which can be very significant, much more than the cost of adaptation, mitigation is not included. It should be added extra. Next, please. Next.
Yes, sir.
Next slide. The technology selected, as you can see, is 60% comes from solar PV. Some another 23% comes from wind. Nuclear gives 2%. Hydro and pump storage 5%, and biomass and small hydro 1%, and coal and CCS. We have included carbon capture and storage as 9% in this. Gas virtually 0%, less than 1%. And battery storage is important here. It comes to 8,815 gigawatt hour. Next, please. Yeah, and the top red line here, in this sense, we are just saying daily what happens, what is generated, what is stored, and what is when it is stored and when it is taken from the storage is shown here. And the red line, top red line, is the demand. Bottom yellow ochre line is the excess electricity. And you can see yellow is the solar. There is a lot of solar available extra, which is then stored. And then the filled up side on two sides with dark brown are the one where we are drawing from the storage. And you can see the difference in April and July. In July, we have a much more available power from wind. And so the blue color wind is shown, is available, and so on. So less is required from the storage. Next, please. I think the policy issues and the concerns are really the renewable and nuclear potential need to be reassessed. We may have specified too low, and how to get states to install renewables at the same time, how to get the state center to increase its non-fossil capacity. And we have to worry about stranded asset compensation. loss of employment, etc. And main thing, how to raise climate finance without affecting growth. This is very critical. Next, please. And I think for Atmanirbhar Bharat, technological independence would be very critical. We should have a battery cost research so that we can develop new types of batteries and don't have to depend so much on lithium-ion batteries. That solar PV efficiency improvement can be very critical because the area required would go down, and therefore much more capacity and potential for solar PV can be there. And carbon capture technology development and potential assessment, we need to find out where it can be stored and whether it is potential is there or not in India. And of course, off-river hydro and pump storage is very critical because, you know, its cost is only half that of on-river hydro storage, and it can be available in 1 or 2 years. Now, I think also we need to have energy efficient equipment development. These are all critical elements that we should do it. And I think we can just go to the, that's about the main thing I wanted to point out. What is it that we need to do and where this model our critical elements are where we require some further work on it. Next, please. Now, this is the end of my presentation. So you can stop this, Sharmishta. And may I now introduce Professor Nick Stern. He is the I.G. Patel Chair Professor at the London School of Economics. He is also the chairman of the Grantham Research Institute and climate change and the environment of that institute, and is the head of the India Observatory at the London School of Economics. He was chief economist for the European Bank as well as the World Bank, and he is very well known in the area of work he has done in climate change, in economics theory, in trade policy, in tax policy, and I would even add understanding how rural development and dynamics change place with his pioneering work in Indian village called Palanpur. Nick Stern, dear friend of mine.
Thank you so much, Kirit. I've been learning from Kirit and Jyoti now for almost 50 years, since I first came to India in 1974. And Kirit and I were on the 5th floor of the Yojana Bhavan in the Indian Statistical Institute. Also others on the call for a similar period of time, Nitin also for almost 50 years. So I feel very much that I'm amongst friends, and particularly friends that I've learnt from throughout this period. And the work that Kirit just presented is a very fine example of serious economics, tackling a big question and getting involved in the detail. I'm not going to get involved in the detail here, but I do note how that discussion has moved on so strongly. Just a few weeks ago, listening to Montek Singh Ahluwalia and his collaborators on this subject, and Ajay Mathur, of course, has been working away on the details of the modeling. So that work, you know, with people of the caliber of Kirit and Jyoti and Montek and Ajay is surely providing very powerful evidence very quickly on what can be done. I think what can be done is very impressive. Also impressive is how much it will cost, but there are tremendous benefits flowing from it if we get it right. So I just wanted to run through the big picture very quickly. The first is that the purpose of all this is, of course, to manage temperature increase and climate change. And India is especially vulnerable in this story with its dependence with the snow and the glaciers and the snow from the Himalayas for its water supply, and much of North India with the vulnerability to cyclones on the coast, challenges of desertification in some places. And now we also see that with unmanaged climate change, the heat itself could in northeast India within a few decades, or at least within several decades, be of a level where humans couldn't be outside for more than 3 or 4 hours. So the stakes we're playing for are enormous as a world, and India, of course, especially vulnerable. The second is that India is an extraordinarily important place. It seems banal to make a statement like that, you know, with a country of well over 1 billion people. So just sheer weight of numbers and where growth in the world will come, India is a crucially important place in terms of overall emissions. Unless India goes to net zero, the world will not go to net zero or anywhere near it. But also India is very important as an example. People learn from India, people look at India, people ask, what is India doing? What is India showing? How is India taking this on? So India has become a very important example. I mean, India is what, nearly 1 billion vaccinations now? People look to India to see how things are done. And I'll emphasize that a little more. But it's not just the weight of numbers, it's India's example and influence in the world. And India's influence in the world is a very powerful and important thing. Well, we know it's tough. We know it involves a lot of investment, but we should also list India's advantages. India, you know, 80% of India's infrastructure that there will be in 2050 has yet to be built. So India has the opportunity to follow a growth path which is very different from others. India also has technological leadership. Just to go through the people I happen to know well personally, if you look at Dalmia Cement, they're leading the charge in the world on decarbonizing cement. If you look at Renewable, they're coming in at extraordinarily low round-the-clock solar prices. If you look at Reliance and Mukesh Ambani's objective of $1 per kg green hydrogen within 1 decade. If you look at what firms like TCS and Infosys and so on can do in managing systems, we have to recognize now that India is in many cases in the forefront, in the vanguard of the key technologies. So there's a lot of advantages there in terms of taking on this enormous transition. And we really do have to emphasize time and again how big that is. Philip Hildebrand, the vice president or vice chair of BlackRock, described it at a seminar I was at 10 days ago as the biggest capital reallocation since the Industrial Revolution. And you could argue actually before that. So as we recognize the magnitude, we should also recognize India's potential advantages in not only in that the infrastructure is to be built, but also in the technological skills that India has. The scale of the investment, I mean, we really are talking about 3, 4, 5% of GDP with the power and related sectors sustained over this whole decade, and of course, way beyond that decade to the middle of the century. It's a tremendous increase in investment for India. The numbers we've been looking at for the scale of investment increase around the world for net zero is 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP. In India, it's probably 4 or 5. And that is the challenge then that we have to deal with. And of course, within that, or perhaps in addition to it, the challenges of a just transition and managing the dislocation movement out of coal. So it comes down then to obviously a clear strategy of what you're trying to do, but also how you get it done. And the reform, of course, of the power sector in India is a hard challenge, one that many people have struggled with over many years. The Government of India Act 1935, for which I apologize as a Brit, allocated all the electricity in principle to the states, which didn't make it makes the whole problem of reform so much more difficult. But if we're to get all these systems on stream, get the technologies on stream that Kirit was describing, how that overall grid system, distribution system functions is going to be enormously important. So the last part then of what to say is how to get that finance moving. It is investment which has got tremendous returns way beyond the reduced emissions. Cities where you can move and breathe, and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful, much more efficient power and other systems. This is really good investment, plus of course the fundamental gain of reducing the risk of climate change. So it has to be financed. How is that investment going to be financed? That seems to me to be a very important part of research and activism in the coming months, and indeed in the coming weeks. Right at the beginning of the Paris summit, Prime Minister Modi was on the phone to Barack Obama saying, look, for us, it's the cost of capital. If we have to pay 8–9% real on these investments, it's just going to be much too difficult. How do we bring down the cost of capital? He was absolutely right. That question is still there, although I think we've learned something more about how to get that done. Well, domestic resource mobilization will be part of that story. So I think we can't think of increasing investment by 3, 4, 5% of GDP without thinking of the whole macro financing funding structure. So domestic resource mobilization is going to be an important part of this story. India is very influential in the MDBs, and I do think that strong pressure from India for the MDBs to expand their lending, including their concessional lending, but to expand their lending very powerfully over the coming years is enormously important. It's going to be a very big part of the story. There are technical issues around single borrow limits for the World Bank and so on. All these things can be overcome, but they have to be addressed in a very purposive, strong way. So I think if India could work with the G7 countries, work through the G20 to push the international financial institutions for a very substantial increase in climate finance, and in terms of also the bilateral flows, which are going to help with the concession of money, which will be important for things like the just transition. Finally, there's the voluntary carbon markets. Those flows could be up to 100 billion a year in a few years' time. Many of us who are working on that would put the priorities as driving past coal, number one, for which of course India fits enormously well, and for natural capital. Negative emissions, of course, associated with natural capital. India in a very good position for that too. But it's going to be, to fund investment on that scale involves, of course, creating the conditions for investment, but also, and where I focused my remarks, on the funding. And I think one has to look at domestic resource mobilization, the flows from the international institutions, the voluntary carbon markets, and of course, where India will be very strong in the private capital markets for investment. But you're going to need all those things to fund investment on this scale. I do think it's possible, and the kind of foundations that you've been laying out here are a fundamental importance. But this is a place where I think that India can lead the world, but India has a right to look to the world. And this is where the story of justice comes in my view, not so much about quarreling about carbon space, which is the kind of conversation which I think comes to a dead end fairly quickly, but, and this is enormously important, low-cost finance. Low-cost finance, I think, is the biggest part of the response to the justice story. And there's a very powerful justice story behind all this, that I hope we can steer that story of justice in the low-cost finance direction, because I think that's the best chance of making a difference. So thank you, Kirit and Jyoti, for having me. It's lovely to see you. I do hope you'll excuse me if I disappear because I've got to go and speak on another Zoom almost right away. But I'm hoping very much to seeing you both, and I hope Nitin and others on this call in Glasgow. In Glasgow, you'll be able to have to work to understand the accent. I hope my accent was a bit easier. So thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Nick. If there are any questions and comments, we will give you by email because you have to go. But thanks you for bringing all these issues to the table. May I?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, right. Bye-bye. May I now invite Dr. Gauri Singh, Deputy Director General of IRADe, the International Renewable Energy Agency. And she has been with the Indian government for many, many years and has worked for more than 30 years in policy, advocacy, and project implementation in the field of renewable energy and sustainable development. And I would point out that she was responsible for leading the development of the National Solar Mission in 2010. And that really provided an early policy framework designed to drive solar power development across the country. So Dr. Gauri Singh.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parekh, and thank you so much to both you and Dr. Jyoti Parekh for inviting me to this very important webinar. And I remember when you were there in the Planning Commission, I think one of your big passion was to make sure that we had an integrated energy policy in place. And that it actually has become more important as we move into this decade, which is being defined as the decade of action. I think what Dr. Stern pointed out was so important because it's not because of the pressure that the world leaders might be putting on India to declare a net zero strategy, but it is something that needs to be done because of the situation that we as a country are in, where the demand for power is going to increase, and we will also need to look at the other end use sectors as we move along, because climate change is something that we have already started seeing impacting the vulnerable society, the vulnerable parts of our society. So what I'd like to do really is to talk a little bit about the work that we have done at IRADe, and we've actually looked at the IPCC recent study, and we've done a scenario of a 1.5 degree scenario where we want to look at what kind of climate actions are needed to limit the global warming to 1.5 degree. So I do have a few slides which might just help in making this a little bit more visual. And if I could, I'll try and share my screen. And if I can't do it, I've also sent it to Sharmishta, so she could probably help me with it. So I'll first try and share my screen. Is this visible?
Ma'am, not yet. Yes, ma'am, it is.
All right. So essentially, what we have done is created a scenario which, and we've looked at the planned energy scenario, which is if we go as per what the national strategies of countries across the world have put in the public domain, the annual emissions would reach about 36 gigatons of carbon by 2050. And if we have to reach the 1.5 degree scenario, then emissions would need to drop by would need to drop to net zero in all sectors, and naturally additional effort would have to be taken in sectors like power, transport, heating and cooling, building and industry. Aligned with is the next slide now visible?
Yes, ma'am. The one on electricity is a central energy carrier?
That's right. That's
yes.
right.
Yes, that's right.
All right. So what we feel is that because as Dr. Parikh had also pointed out, that energy sector is responsible globally for about 80% of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. So naturally, it will play a very central role in delivering the required decarbonization. And it's very challenging, and there's also a very short time window that is available for us, which means that urgent actions would be needed at multiple fronts. But the good news is that most of the technologies that are needed to reach net zero emissions globally by 2050 are already available today. So in fact, 90% of the solutions in 2050 involve renewable energy through direct supply, electrification, energy efficiency, green hydrogen, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So as you can see, fossil fuels will decline by more than 75% by 2050. They'll still have a role, mainly in power and mostly for industry, but provide about 19% of the primary energy supply in 2050. Oil and coal will in fact drop the fastest, with natural gas peaking around 2025. And in the power sector, we see that coal generation would get cut by half in 2030, and again by half by 2040, and then get phased out. So coal, the remaining coal demand would largely be restricted to industry, mostly for steel production and chemical production. And natural gas would be the largest remaining source of fossil fuel by 2050, which will be used primarily in industrial processes like blue hydrogen production and in power plants. So electricity will become the main energy carrier with more than 50% of direct share of final energy consumption, moving up from 21%. And 90% of the total electricity needs would be supplied by renewables, followed by 6% coming from natural gas and remaining from nuclear. So the shift happens because of the rapid electrification of end-use applications, along with the rise in demand coming from green hydrogen production. So for meeting that, the electricity generation would need to grow threefold. And for renewables to supply 90% of it, the renewable energy deployment would grow from 2,800 gigawatts that it's currently at to about 28,000. So it's a 10-fold increase by 2050. So in all the sectors, the mitigation effort has to come. And I don't understand that we're largely talking about the power sector here, but I just want to spend a minute talking about other sectors also, because the other sectors are going to start becoming extremely important for India as we ramp up our efforts on renewable energy and for the power sector. So we do see that renewables, energy conservation and efficiency, more electrification in end-use sectors, hydrogen, and modern bioenergy are pretty much going to form the main pillars of the decarbonization actions that would be needed. Now, I just want to draw the attention towards what kind of investments would be needed. And here, it's as Dr. Stern pointed out, although globally what it means is about maybe about 2 to 3% of the global GDP, and in India's regard, he pointed out it could be about 4%. But if you're looking at what the current plans of the governments are across the world, cumulatively it's about $98 trillion going into energy, but what would be needed is an additional $33 trillion, which translates to annually to about 4.4 million. And the trends do show that the investments in the electrified transport are on the rise. So are the investments in the electric heating have also risen in the last few years. And really, it's the investment and policy decisions that we take in this decade that will really define whether we will be able to reach the desired outcome. In fact, in 2020, when most of the other sectors globally were facing challenges, we did see a record deployment of renewable energy going to about 260 gigawatts. And the investments in the global energy transition hit also a record high of $524 billion. And in that, it was the renewable energy technologies that dominated. However, now as investments is also going to other energy transition technologies, the share of this renewable energy technologies has declined from 90% in the last decade to about 70% now. Energy efficiency investments is also, it averages to about 250 billion during the last 5-6 years. So clearly, the emerging markets are going to be the key, and they unless they are participating in this energy transition, there will be no energy transition. And in fact, I do want to point out here that while we do tend to focus on the technologies and the deployment of technologies, but I think what's going to be extremely important, and more so in the case of India, is going to be the investments and the planning and the investments that we have for upgrading the grid infrastructure, because that globally would need to more than double as per our estimates. And this I think is very critical, especially in the context of the fact that electricity is a concurrent subject, and which means that it has its own challenges in terms of how the policies will drive investments in both at both the central and the state level. So our sense is that if we are to reach these kind of investment levels, all sources of capital, public, private, equity, debt, all would need to be mobilized. And currently, most of this comes from private sources, and this is a trend we think will continue. While the public sector on an average provides only about 14% of annual investments, but it's very critical because it helps to lower the risks and overcome the initial barriers which are needed to attract investors and bring these markets to maturity. And especially when we are going to start talking about the end use sector, I think this will continue to remain very critical. I just want to end by this slide on the policy framework. I think in the Indian context, innovation in policy has played a very important role in being able to attract finance, and it'll continue to remain very important. But innovation, we normally just think about innovation in technology, which is definitely important, but it's also innovation in the business models and market design and regulation and in financing that will become extremely important as we move forward. So while global drivers and as we heard that possibly the financial sector is making the biggest shift in financial allocations that we've ever seen, they will continue to remain extremely important. But the domestic drivers are critical and have to be recognized when we frame the strategy for moving ahead in this decade especially, and then in the coming decades. So I'll just like to then end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I think it was a very interesting global perspective you have provided. And I see that Mr. Kant is with us. Dr. Amitabh Kant, is the chief CEO of Niti Aayog. And he was till recently Secretary, Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion. And he is, of course, an IAS from the Kerala cadre of 1980 batch. And he has a wide range of understanding of India's problems in not just energy, but it's interrelated to all the issues of development, human development, etc., which certainly is at the focus of Niti Aayog's work. May I now request Mr. Amitabh Kant to make his presentation? Mr. Kant?
Mr. Kant, sir, you are muted. Kindly unmute. Maybe they've just logged in, but Mr. Kant is still not there. 1 second, sir. I'll just make a call to his assistant. Sir, he's just joining.
Yeah. I think questions that were raised by, issues raised by Nick Stern and Gauri Singh are important. The amount of resources required are very, very critical. And we need that climate finance at cheap finance, as say, which in my term, my understanding would mean that it is a 5-10 years of moratorium and 2% or less interest rate would provide the necessary support to Indian effort to decarbonize or push renewables as far as possible. And the question that was raised about, somebody raised in the chat, the question of, why is it that you are only concentrating on power sector? Because power sector is critical for even when you are going for substituting fossil fuel. Electric vehicles is required. For substituting in many, many industries, electricity can play a major role for substituting fossil fuels, coal, etc. So I think a large number of substitution possibilities come from electricity. And therefore, I think electricity's decarbonization is very critical. For example, today, if you take an electric vehicle and if you run it on India's electricity with its current mix, the emissions would be higher than if you were to run it with an electricity which is largely run on renewables and so on. So even for substituting fossil fuel in various issues, we need decarbonized electricity sector. And that's why we have selected electricity sector as the first sector to concentrate on it. So while we are waiting for Shrikant, I don't know how long would it take. What is says Sharmishta, any information?
Yes, he said, I'll just tell Mr. Khan.
Join at 5. He wanted to join at 5 and he wanted to.
He said he'll just inform him because they had connected, his office had connected.
Make a shorter presentation before it's possible.
I'll call him once again.
Maybe Nitin may like to say some things, or Anshu.
Desai is, is a very distinguished person. He was a well-known economist in India anyway, and internationally, because the Under-Secretary General of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations. And I can say that in organizing the Rio Summit in 1992, he played a very important role. He was this, helped Maurice Strong and others to do this organization. But now I think Mr. Kant is here. So may I request Mr. Kant to make his presentation? Before you came, I introduced you as the person who knows a lot about not only power sector, but the entire economic and development issues in the country. So, Mr. Kant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parekh. Wonderful to be with all of you. I'm delighted to be speaking today. India has already achieved emission intensity reduction of about 27% over 2005 levels against the target of 33 to 35% by 2030, which we had committed to in our NDC, the Nationally Determined Contributions. This actually makes India among one of the few countries globally which has kept its Paris climate change COP21 commitments. Now, the Indian power sector has achieved the milestone of 100 gigawatt of installed renewable energy capacity, and 50 gigawatt of additional capacity is presently under installation. And another 27 gigawatts is under tendering process. So about close to 177 gigawatt. Presently, India stands at 4th position in the world in terms of installed RE capacity, 5th in solar, and 4th in wind energy capacity. If you look at August 2021, about 39% of India's installed power generation capacity is based on non-fossil based energy sources, including hydro. And with this pace, we will reach the target of 40% by 2023. Now, further, India has already announced 450 gigawatt RE target by 2030. The solar potential and wind potential for the country is huge. The estimates made a few years back are not valid as of now due to better technology and efficiency improvements. Solar is the one which will drive India's clean energy transition agenda. At the same time, wind installation has to be also expedited, which has been somewhat stagnant after 2017 due to the change in tariff regime. The One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative for a transnational solar power grid can be a game changer to help nations meet intermittent generation issues and climate change goals. It will also help drive down the need for storage and in effect reduce the cost of the energy transition. India's green growth story will be further catalyzed through green hydrogen economy. The National Hydrogen Mission announced on Independence Day by Honorable Prime Minister will reduce the emission in the hard to abate sectors. We are presently importing around 160 billion worth of fossil fuel energy. Electricity is responsible for only 18% of energy. The balance 82% is hard to abate sectors like refinery, fertilizer, long distance transportation, steel, etc. Green hydrogen can play a significant role in achieving India's decarbonization strategy. India is poised to become global hub for manufacturing of electrolyzer and export of green hydrogen products only because the solar prices are low and we need to bring them further down. This is important. Climate finance of $100 billion per year and related technology transfer obligations by developed countries to developing countries to facilitate emission cuts would be a very, very important enabler to combat emission issues for the developing countries. To my mind, low-cost finance is the key because low interest rates are very important. And that will be the key to accelerate energy transition in real economies of developing countries. Although a net zero target date is not yet been finalized, but it's important to understand that India is the only country which has fulfilled its NDC targets. The other 19 G20 countries have not, and they've been changing goalposts. It's important for India also, as it has demonstrated, that we are committed to reducing emissions. But there is if a common net zero emissions date for all countries is fixed, it's important that developed world, they advance their date of net zero from 2050 to at least bring it to 2030, and they look at achieving short-term goals rather than putting long-term goals. The countries which have announced their net zero targets have taken transition gaps from 71 years to 40 years from peaking to net zero target year. Now, climate justice and just transition require a balanced approach to move ahead with a mix of traditional and newer options while increasing the share of greener options in the energy mix steadily. This would help energy prices in a relatively manageable range while preserving the ideals of energy democracy and energy justice. The power sector would be the torchbearer of India's story of just transition and addressing the climate issues simultaneously. The electricity constitutes only, as I said, and I've been saying, only 18% of the entire primary energy consumption. Rest, more than 80% of energy comprises of fossils, which are directly being consumed in industries, transport, and other sectors as fuel. We have to target this 80% energy for decarbonization. It is also true that the entire power cannot be fed into grid system. Therefore, decentralized mode of RE-based applications need to be promoted. My view is that it's very important for us for India to accelerate wind and solar, because on the basis of that only we will be able to do green hydrogen. Without wind and solar, it will not be possible to do green hydrogen, and the cost of wind and solar needs to come down radically. and we need to make India the center for green hydrogen, and we need to make India the center for electrolyzer manufacturing. And this would necessitate that in the initial years, we'll have to mandate the use of green hydrogen in certain hard to abate sector so that prices come down. The prices are in the region of $4 per kg. They need to come down to about 2.5 by 2024-25 and come down to $1 per kilogram by 2030. And this would make India the center for green hydrogen and for electrolyzer manufacturing, and subsequently export green ammonia from India to countries of the Far East, including Japan and Korea. So the energy transition towards cleaner forms of energy, India visualizes through solar, through wind, accelerating the piece, and on the mobility side, through battery storage, and essentially in the hard to abate sector through green hydrogen. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a real pleasure speaking to all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Kant, for sparing your time, and we are really pleased to know this. India has really made a lot of progress. Our concern, as Dr. Jyoti Parikh had said in the first thing, is that instead of giving these long-term targets, let's accelerate the Paris target. Let's have the short-term issues done clearly. Because even if everybody reaches net zero by 2050, let's say, the total stock of emissions in the atmosphere will be so much that the world keep warming even after that. So it is important to keep not just the emissions per year, but the stock of emissions under control. And that's what you have emphasized. Thanks a lot, really. And sorry we can't stay for a little longer, but it would be nice if you could. We can listen to our presentation of the report and so on. So
I'll be here for another 5-10 minutes.
Okay. So I think, may I now request Dr. Anjana Das to make a presentation of the study we have carried out?
Sir, excuse me, before that, could we have a quick photo session, please, while Mr. Kant is with us?
Yeah, of course. Let's have that.
Yes, thank you.
Everybody to please switch on the cameras.
Yeah, please switch on your cameras, and Mohit, you also have to get into action.
Anshu, Dr. Kant, Dr. Josh Singh. Dr. Kakodkar, maybe you are not here, but please turn on your camera. Anshu, if you are there, also turn on the camera. Anyway, let us...
Dr. Kakodkar, can you come up, turn on your audio, video?
Maybe he's not there, but so...
Okay.
Let's just take the photo as it is. We'll take another one when next session ends. Done?
Mohit, could you please confirm?
Yeah.
Yes, please. We can carry on with Anjana.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Anjana, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Parikh. So I share my screen. No, Sharmishra, shall I go? Am I going to share my screen, or you will give me screen right?
No, you share.
No, you can share screen. You have the right.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So can you see my slides?
Yeah, but go to the first slide.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are. So I am going to talk about technological options and cost of decarbonizing India's power system. Objective is straightforward. So we are assessing technology and cost implications of achieving net zero of the Indian power sector in different target dates, because that influences the cost as well. So we have chosen target dates to 2050 and 2060. Key research questions include what would be the role of different technologies, because technology is going to play the most important role. So what would be the, which technologies would be the prominent technologies, what would be the technology roadmap, and so on. Technologies, cost of technologies are declining. So what would be that implication on decarbonizing the system? What potentials of different RE sources would be required, because India so far does not have proper estimations of some of the resources. Like some of them are old, some of them need to be revised because technology has progressed. India has about 3,500 kilometers of coastal line. Wind offshore potential is high, but so far assessment is not made, although a lot of talks are going on related to wind offshore technology. So this is important to know what kind of potential would be required. CCS as nuclear, these are two dispatchable technologies. So what would be their role? Because other dispatchable technology is only biomass, which is a small amount, about 20 or 30 gigawatt or so. In the decarbonized system, there would be strong presence of wind as well as solar, both intermittent. So what would be the implication on battery storage? Electricity demand growth, which is somehow uncertain. So what would be the impact on different rate of development of electricity demand? And finally, cost of reaching net zero, which could be different in different target years. And what would be the climate finance needs, some indication if we can obtain from here. And some amount of policy implications, as Professor Parekh has already indicated in his presentation earlier. So methodologies we have employed, we use IEA message software, which is a least cost dynamic linear programming based on linear programming framework. Modeling time frame is 2015 to 2085, divided into several 5 years period. Annual electricity demand is exogenous to the model. And as intermittent technologies would have heavy presence in the future system, so model captures in finer details the seasonal and daily variations of load as well as supply from intermittent sources, so that demand of electricity as well as load are matched as much as possible. And some of the particular technologies like pump storage, CCS power plant, battery storage are modeled as well. So assumptions include all costs are in constant 2015 USD, real discount rate is 4%. A comprehensive list of technologies are modeled, and they are represented through technical and economic parameters. We have assumed first decline in capital cost of RE and storage technologies like solar PV, solar thermal, and so on. 25 gigaton of cumulative CO2 storage capacity for India. And then we have assumed CO2 transport and storage cost as 15 USD per ton from 2030 onwards. As this is a least cost model, so we had to impose some upper bounds on different technologies, otherwise model will pick up some unrealistic numbers. So these are the upper bounds we have imposed. Electricity demand development we have estimated based on high GDP growth over next 50 years, but declining rate of electricity GDP elasticity. Just give me a second, sorry for this. So this shows the electricity demand development in next up to 2050 and 60. So demand goes in 2050, demand goes to about 7,000 terawatt hour, which is about 5 times higher than as of today. Further goes up to about 9,000 terawatt hour in 2060. Although it looks high growth, 5 to 6 times increase from today, but if you see the per capita consumption would remain 4,200 kilowatt hour in 2050, which is quite modest, which is about 30% of current China's per capita consumption and much lower than US or EU countries. Scenarios we have simulated 3 scenarios. BAU scenarios assume current policies are in place like renewable targets, NDC goal, and so on. We have developed one NZ50 scenario that assumes slow stabilization of CO2 emissions from the power sector at 200 million tons from 2050 and continue afterwards. India has a large sequestration potential, which is basically negative emissions. So some positive emissions would be possible. And we have allocated 200 million tons to the power sector. And we have developed another net zero scenario, NZ60. It is same as NZ50, but it assumes system will reach 0.2 gigaton in 2060 and follow and will continue afterwards. CO2 black line show the CO2 emissions trajectory at the BAU scenario. You can see how it is growing rapidly over time, over the next 30, 40 years. And blue line shows the NZ50 trajectories, which peak in the year 2030 and then stabilize at 200 million tons in 2050 and continue thereafter. Orange line shows the trajectory for NZ60, which peaks in the year 2035 and then stabilizes at same amount 200 million tons in 2060. So what would be the implication on capacity and generation requirement in all these scenarios? We are focusing on NZ50 and NZ60. So this slide shows the capacity requirement for both fossil and non-fossil. Non-fossil includes solar PV, wind, hydro, large hydro, small hydro, nuclear, etc. So by the year 2050, India, in the case of NZ50 and NZ60, India needs about 3,200 gigawatt of power generation capacity, which is about 8 times than what it has today. And this will go up further to 5,000 gigawatt in 2060. And out of which about 90% or more will come from the non-fossil sources. Looking into the generation need will be about 8,000 terawatt hour, 5 to 6 times more than what it is producing today, about something like 1550 terawatt hour. And this will further go up to 10,000 terawatt hour in 2060. About 75 to 90% will come from non-fossil sources. And out of that, wind and solar will provide about 75 to 85% of the generation. I'll show you further breakup by technologies. So this shows the renewable technology. So you can see all yellow. So it would be solar, which would be the dominant technology. And you can see it reaches the entire upper limit we have imposed to it, 2,000 gigawatt in 2050 and 3,000 gigawatt in 2060. Next is wind, followed by wind. Again, its situation is same. It will reach the entire upper bound we have imposed to it. So if India wants to decarbonization by 2050 or 2060, starting from today, every year, India needs to add 65 gigawatt of solar PV, 23 gigawatt of wind till 2050. And this is a havoc task, and this needs a lot of policy support and lot of other activities. But this is not undoable. If you see between 2019 and 2020, China has added 70 gigawatt of solar PV, wind and 50 gigawatt of solar PV. So this is doable. And so since this is a large amount of intermittent technology, this will be supported by obviously large amount of storage, battery storage in the range of 8,000 gigawatt hour to 13,000 gigawatt hour. But for your information, India has its first grid-based battery storage technology 8 months ago of about 500 kilowatt hour. And second one is added just 1 month ago next to our office of about 400 kilowatt hour. So total so it has started. Total is about 1,000 kilowatt hour or 1 megawatt hour. So it needs to be scaled up to megawatt to gigawatt and further so on. This slide shows the non-dispatchable capacity requirement. This requirement is very high, but we have imposed a strict upper limits on it because things are unknown to us. we have assumed 25 gigaton of cumulative CO2 storage, and CO2 plant is also not completely CO2 free. It is carbon capture, we have assumed about 90%, so about still 10% release will be there. And we have also assumed about 60 gigawatt of nuclear capacity by 2050 and 80 gigawatt by 2060, and almost entirely has been eaten up by the system. This is the importance and this is the need of the dispatchable capacity by the system. So, so this slide shows the average dispatch of the Indian power system in a typical summer day. So yellow color shows the solar PV generating during daytime. Purple or violet color besides it shows the battery storage discharging after sunset, before sunrise, and orange color in the negative axis shows the how battery is being charged when there is sun. Cost additional, so decarbonization does not come at a lower cost and not without cost. So this slide shows the additional investment and total cost requirement over BAU over the period 2030 and to 60. So decarbonization cost is high, and the early you decarbonize, cost it is more. So first one is investment requirement between 2030 and 60 for achieving NZ 50, which is 2.4 trillion. So it is about 80 billion additional dollar between 2030 to 60 every year. That indicates, that gives some indication of climate finance requirement. And next one is total energy system cost, which goes up again by $1.9 trillion, implicating that there will be increase in electricity supply cost as well. If decarbonization is postponed, cost goes down as well. So NZ60, we see when decarbonization is been done in 2060, investment needs goes down to $1.8 trillion and energy system cost to $1.3 trillion. We have also done sensitivity analysis on how capital cost of some of the prominent technology will be unfolded from today till 2050. So the numbers what I showed you so far is based on a first decline in the capital cost of these prominent technologies. For example, solar PV 27%, meaning we have assumed in 2050 solar PV cost will be 27% of what it is today. So if that does not happen, what would be the implication on the process? So we have done one slow development of these technologies as well. So in that case, we have assumed, for example, solar PV cost will be, capital cost of solar PV will be 47% of what it is today in 2050. These numbers are generated based on international nationally available sources like BNEF, IRADe, NREL, and so on. So there would be implication definitely. So here we are reporting the investment implications for NZ50 in the year 2050. So investment requirement will go up by 20 to 25% depending upon where you are. So if the cost development of renewables do not occur the way you expect, there would be further cost increase. We have also done demand sensitivity on the sensitivity on electricity demand. We have made a case where electricity demand will stabilize in 2050 onwards with heavy implementation of energy efficiency. It is trivial. If demand is less, generation will be less, capacity will be less, infrastructure requirement will be less, and so on. But what is not trivial, excuse me. Is just forgive me, some problem. So what is not trivial, which we saw from the system, that there will be a system adjusts much early in 2030 when there is not even any changes in the demand. And by the year 2050, by the year 2060, there will be less requirement of solar PV by 800 gigawatt, less requirement of CCS by 30 to 40 gigawatt, and so on. But there will be more requirement of coal supercritical technology, about 20 gigawatt or so, to provide cheap flexibility, operating at 26% rate. I have some problem, sorry.
I think you can conclude then. Okay.
So I put my concluding remarks based on my whatever I remember. So what we see from our analysis and from our study, prominent technologies are solar PV, wind, large hydro, battery storage, pump storage, and so on. If India needs to achieve its net zero by 2050 or beat 2060, it needs to add huge amount of, I think if I remember correctly, something like 60 gigawatt of solar PV, 23 gigawatt of wind every year, starting from today for the next 30 years, 2050, which is heavy task, needs policy, a lot of activities and policy supports and a lot of other things. Dispatchable technologies like CCS, nuclear, they have very important role to play, but their potential need to be assessed carefully. Net zero decarbonization comes with cost. There will be additional investment requirement. There will be additional system cost, and achieving it early will be more investment intensive and more cost intensive as well. We have seen also unfolding of renewable technology cost would have strong demand, a strong impact on the decarbonization process, and so is the demand development. We have, I have already, Professor Parekh has spoken about policy implication. I give just few of them. If I remember, based on my whatever I remember, lot of things are unknown. We don't know the potentials of many, most of the renewable resources. So for the policymakers, studies or assessment need to be carried out on renewables, CCS, nuclear, and so on. Also, assessment studies should be carried out on feasibility and implication and policy packages for adding such a large amount of renewables and other capacity in next 30 years time frame. Also, one needs to look into employment skill implications. And finally, last point is the climate finance. So this study gives some indication of climate finance, and one can explore from there what would be the climate finance requirement to achieve such a huge transition of the energy system. That's all about my presentation. So I thank you all for your participation, for your time. I also thank the International Atomic Energy Agency, my past employer, for allowing to use message model for this study. And I thank some of my colleagues who are also here. Thank you for all of your support. So that's all from me. Thank you all.
Thank you, Anjana. I think it's time for us to go to the panel discussion. And Hima, do you have to say anything?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you everyone for the impactful and engaging inaugural session. We now move on to the technical session. I would request our esteemed panelists to present their thoughts on this critical issue. Today, we have an illustrious panel lined up with us. The panel would be chaired and moderated by Shri Nitin Desai, former Under Secretary General, United Nations. Shri Desai is a distinguished economist and a well-known voice in public policy, especially in the sustainable development sector. Then we have with us Mr. Anil Kakotkar, former Chairman, Atomic Energy Commission and the Secretary to the Government of India. He was also the Director of the Bhabha Atomic Research Center. We also have with us Dr. Winfried Dahm, Director, Indo-German Energy Program, GIZ. He worked as member of National Parliament in the energy sector and joined the Municipal Utility of Leipzig. We also have with us Dr. Peter Zuniewski, Energy Analyst, International Energy Agency, and the Chancellor's Fellow, Energy and Society, the University of Edinburgh. We are also pleased to have with us Dr. Anshu Bharadwaj, CEO, Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation. He was also a member of the Indian Administrative Services 1992 batch. I request Shri Desai to kindly initiate the panel discussion. Over to you, sir.
Unmute yourself, Nitin. Nitin, unmute.
Thank you very much. We've just heard some excellent presentations of the work that has been done in IRADe on this very important dimension of the climate change challenge. I will not take any more time. If we have time at the end, I will say a few words. Let me therefore first begin by asking Dr. Kakodkar. Dr. Kakodkar, you're there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes, Kakodkar sir.
Hello.
Please. Tell us.
Well, thank you. I am in a very awkward position. From the presentations that we saw, it looked like India needs nuclear power in much larger measure than has been than the constraint that has been put on the analysis, because the program shows those numbers. So that is the first observation that I would like to make. And clearly there is some correction.
We really want to understand your perspective on what can be done in this, so that we can refine our analysis further.
No, it's not a question of analysis. It's a question of the decision-making process at the national level.
Yeah.
But I'll talk about it shortly. Now, I want to draw your attention to a study which was done by MIT, and many of you might have seen that already. But I think in the present context, it's very important. The title of that study is The Future of Nuclear Energy in a Carbon-Constrained World. And there are many, it's a comprehensive report. But if I have to just read out the broad options, it says that the minimum average system cost, not at the generation level, but as available to the user, cost of electricity, if you take a scenario where there is no nuclear, because there is an opinion around the world that there is no nuclear. So the minimum average cost of electricity in a scenario when there is no nuclear, compared to minimum average cost of electricity when nuclear is included, and we are talking about zero emission. Finally, this is a situation when we reach zero emission. So you admit only those sources which do not emit CO2. Now, if you compare these scenarios, and they have looked at a few regions in the world. So for a region, New England of USA, the minimum average cost without nuclear, according to that study, is twice that of the minimum average cost with nuclear. They also looked at TBT region in China, and their conclusion is that the minimum average cost without nuclear is 4 times the minimum average cost with nuclear. With regard to installed capacity, the same analysis concludes that the nuclear installed capacity as a percentage of peak demand in the US case, they estimate that it should be around 60%. And in the Chinese case, they estimate that to be around 80%. So, so you may be clear why I am in a big dilemma and a big quandary. Now, this is an analysis on one side. I'm very happy to see the analysis presented by IRADe based on the IAEA code. But I think we need to do many more such studies. And I think what we saw here was the first some such study I saw. Otherwise, there is no such study in the country which exists. And there are, of course, each study is based on its own model and all. So I will leave it at that. I am not going to get into that. The short point that I think we need to recognize that how do we address this problem? First, let us talk about technology. The capital cost or the overnight capital cost of the Indian PHWRs, 700 megawatt PHWRs, for which government has approved 10 units. So if you take that sanctioned cost of those 10 units and compare that, it is compared to the imported nuclear power plants, this would be half or less than half in terms of capital cost. And even if you compare in terms of solar, the capital cost for generating an X amount of electricity in a year for solar versus nuclear, on an overnight cost basis, you would find that this capital cost is actually cheaper than solar. So these are facts. No numerical or arithmetic mistake there. They're absolute facts. The question is, why then we are in this situation? And of course, the issue lies in the gestation period. It takes a long time. Nuclear is not eligible for the low-cost finance, and so on and so forth. So it looks to me that we are not able to grow nuclear capacity, which is so necessary for net zero, and which will give a low-cost option. And a factor of 2 or factor of 4 in the electricity cost also raises the issue of competitiveness of the economy as a whole, because that's the electricity that will go to industry, that will affect the production cost and so on and so forth. So I would squarely put this issue in the lap of policy making to kind of derive the full advantage for nuclear. Now, I think I will stop here and not make my own comments because I cannot implement them. Thank you.
Unmute, Nitin.
That means that what Dr. Kakolkar is suggesting is you have a second look at the ceiling you have put on nuclear in your model.
Yes, of course. I'm telling you, instead of that 50 or 60 or 80 gigawatts, if you put a ceiling at maybe 200 or 300 gigawatt, this model will show all of it is required.
We'll have a look.
I have a feel for numbers, and if you do that analysis, it will show that.
Anyway, that's it. Yeah, it's very good thought, very interesting thought. We now turn to Dr. Winifred Dunn and ask him for his comments.
Yes, thank you. Let me comment on nuclear first. So obviously coming from Germany, you know that we are phasing out ongoing existing very nice nuclear plants by next year altogether. We have already phased out more than half of it. And we believe very strongly in that. And the majority of the Germans believe it as well. And as you might know, I'm not aware about any nuclear plant built on economic, let's say, level and purposes only, worldwide. I'm aware about so many nuclear power plants who are being shut off due to economic terms nowadays. There's one power plant coming up in England on the price of more than 9 rupees a unit, plus inflation adjustment. Who wants to buy electricity for 9 rupees plus inflation? You better go for solar. And solar you buy for something between 2 and 3 rupees nowadays. And consider the inflation of India, be it 5%, 7%, something like that. If you consider this for 10 years, then normally on real numbers, price is halving. After 20 years, it's only 1/4. So consider you buy now electricity in India for the year of 2032 for the price of less than 1.5 rupees. And the very same electricity you can buy now for 2040 for a price of less than 0.7 rupees. How marvelous is this? It can be done now. So you only need a reliable contracts, which everyone is aligning to. Let me come back to this very nice study from Dr. Das. Thanks for your presentation. And your numbers are very much in line with all the other presentations we had in the last few weeks or days. You can take the IEA Energy Outlook being released, I think, yesterday or the day before. You can compare it with the CEW study, which came out last week. The numbers are more or less very roughly, very similar. So, and you can compare it with Bloomberg or Terry numbers as well. But what we are talking about, and I'm not referring to net zero carbon. I'm referring to the goals of Mr. Modi. And the goals of Mr. Modi are 450 gigawatt renewables by 2030, as you all know, but also to become energy self-reliant in India by 2047, and to electrify transport, and to lead the world in hydrogen, and to double farmers' incomes, and to have 5 trillion economy. If you combine that, I'm requesting India is not only looking for 450 gigawatt minus 100 gigawatt given, as Mr. Kant nicely pointed out, is 350 to be achieved in 8 years. So these are more than 40 gigawatts already requested by Mr. Modi for renewables only. And all the other things, I'm asking for 100 gigawatts renewable additions every year. And Mrs. Das is more or less the same number you came up with. So yes, whether you talk about zero carbon, whether you talk only about achieving Mr. Modi's visions and goals, we are nearly the same framework. In regards to costs, Assam has right now an average price of more than 5 rupees. Pan India, it's about 3.8 rupees. That's our actual cost, increasing year by year. If you're going for renewables, you're talking something less than 3 rupees. I admit for storage and so on, you need to add something. But I think we are on a good track, and it makes economically sense for India to push and go for that things. Coming back to your study and the political implication, I would love to have seen a little bit more on demand shift. And as Mr. Parekh rightly pointed out, energy efficiency is a key issue. And as your slides presented as well, if you reduce the demand, obviously it becomes cheaper for everyone. So what is required? From my perspective, a lot of planning would help a lot. Reliable policies, and the more you de-risk the investments by having a reliable environment, the cheaper it becomes. So if you start to not honoring contracts from state institutions, from state discoms, obviously the risk perception of the investors will increase. And it will increase for any project, pan-India. So anyone violating this reliable environment is harming the Indian economy, and it's increasing the cost for everyone of India. So coming back to the planning, it's not only planning where to come up with renewable, but obviously where to come up with a better grid and a long-term grid to evacuate all those electricity which is going to come. In regards to finance, there is no lack of finance. Finance is there. A reliable environment for investments is required. My sister company, KfW, is more than happy to lend more to India on interest rates below 1%. So this is low-cost financing, obviously in euro or dollar terms. Probably so much as an input from my side. I'm more than happy to have a frank and open discussion. and looking forward that India is achieving this 100 gigawatt annually of renewable additions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that happy note that the finance is not the issue is the reliability of the investment environment and the predictability of the investment environment. Many thanks. May I now turn to Dr. Peter Ziniowski of the IEA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to such a distinguished panel and such a fascinating event. My name is Peter Ziniewski. I work at the IEA, and I worked as a co-lead of the India Energy Outlook, which we released earlier in February. And I think what I'll try and do is just take a step back and reflect on what's already been achieved in India in recent years. I mean, electricity connections have been brought to hundreds of millions of citizens. Highly efficient LED lighting has come to most households, and there's been a massive expansion of renewable sources of energy. And I think those points were brought out by previous speakers very forcefully. But really the gains for Indian citizens and their quality of life have been tangible. But there's still a lot to do. Naturally, there's a lot of near-term issues, including a lack of reliable electricity supply for many consumers. And there's a continued reliance on solid biomass, mainly firewood, as a cooking fuel. And that's, in the IEA world, not a sustainable source of energy, as it has negative human health impacts. And that affects some 660 million people in India today. And in that backdrop, we have financially ailing electricity distribution companies and air quality that has made Indian cities among the most polluted ones in the world. So massive challenges ahead, both near term and long term. But I'd also like to stress where India is in global energy. It's the third largest energy consuming country. So naturally, what happens in India has large ramifications for the rest of the world. But we have to remind ourselves that on a per capita basis, energy use and emissions are less than half of the world's average. And there are other indicators like vehicle ownership, steel and cement output, where India is likewise below the global average. So over the coming years, we're going to see millions of households buying new appliances, new air conditioners, new vehicles. And that means India is the single largest source of energy demand growth over the next several decades across all of our scenarios. So whether we're in a climate-driven scenario or in our stated policy scenario, that reality holds true. And so today we're talking about power. And as things stand, as we know, solar accounts for less than 5% of generation, and coal is closer to 70. In the STEP scenario, they converge in the low 30%. So coal comes down, solar comes up, and this switch is even rapid in other scenarios as well. And that's all the more impressive when we think about just how much electricity demand is going to grow much more rapidly than overall energy demand. And of course, as we mentioned, there's a sharp rise in variability of that electricity generation and as well in the daily consumption from air conditioners and so on. So meeting those peaks in demand will require flexibility on the supply side. And we just mentioned how nuclear can play a role, thermal generation currently plays that role. How do we get batteries to play that role? In our assessment, batteries paired with solar energy is already competitive. We've seen tenders that are very, very competitive for supplying round-the-clock power, as Dr. Stern said before. So really encouraging signs there that low-carbon sources of flexibility are on the rise. Now, all that said, we're in a very unique situation as we recover from the pandemic. The recovery is putting gas, coal, and power markets under strain as we speak today. So we've seen sharp rises in prices, and that's drawing attention back to the short-term needs and challenges of the Indian energy system, but also of the global energy system. So all of this discussion about long-term strategies has to occur in this short-term consideration, in this short-term space where we see the shadow of the pandemic still looming quite large, blocking progress on increasing energy access and so on. So as we stated in our World Energy Outlook, which was released last week, a new global energy economy is emerging. And of course, India plays a pivotal role in that. So I'd just like to bring that back to the idea, as Dr. Stern pointed out earlier, that a lot of what India is going to have in 2050 just doesn't exist today. Power plants, factories, vehicles and buildings. And so by far the largest current share of emissions comes from India's young and relatively inefficient coal-fired power fleet. But we'll also see huge growth in emissions from other areas, from factories, from industry, and from transport as well. And so if these factories and existing plants are operated as planned, then a lot of the climate goals are already out of reach. So we have to think through how we repurpose the existing infrastructure and how we build new infrastructure as sustainably as possible. And that means thinking about carbon capture, thinking about using biomass or co-firing ammonia and power plants, or retiring plants early and thinking through the financial implications of that. So how do we finance all of that? Dr. Stern also noted that this is one of the most important aspects of India's clean energy transition. We've explored this in some depth in our report on financing clean energy transitions in developing economies. And I think just to think through what the implications are, solar and wind are clearly clean technologies, but there's lots of investment that doesn't neatly fit into clean or dirty. So for example, what about a fertilizer plant that wants to increase its efficiency, or a natural gas plant that comes in to replace coal? These are what we call the middle ground of financing clean energy transitions. And this is something where over half of the investments that we need globally to get to net zero need to occur in this gray space where emissions reductions are contingent on other changes in the energy system. So when we think about electric vehicles, we think about the power generation mix being low carbon. And so we need that to happen before we finance large-scale EV rollouts. So I'd just like to end by saying, of course, this is all going to cost a lot of money, but system costs, as Dr. Das pointed out, are a very pertinent way to think this through. So one of the key findings from our outlook is that India no longer has to import as much oil in a case where it rapidly transitions to clean energy. And that saving we calculated as about $1.4 trillion over the next 20 years. And so that's roughly the equivalent amount that needs to be spent in clean energy technologies. So that capital can be reallocated to those sectors where emissions can be brought down, and there's also lower dependence on imports and so on. So it's about that rebalancing and that capital reallocation that can really drive forward the emissions reductions without adding too much cost to the overall transition. So I'd like to end there, and thank you very much for having me, and happy to discuss further.
Unmute, Nitin. Nitin, unmute. Unmute.
Anshu Bharadwaj. Can I invite Anshu Bharadwaj of the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation for his comments on this? Anshu.
Thank you, sir. And I thank Dr. Kirit Parikh, Dr. Jyoti Parikh, and all IRADe colleagues for inviting me to this webinar. I also congratulate IRADe for this very timely study. We in Shakti are happy to have supported this study. When Dr. Parikh approached us a few months back, it was a very timely topic, and we felt at this juncture, when we are discussing decarbonization, this study will be of tremendous value, and it has been the case. So first of all, many congratulations to you, sir, and the entire team at IRADe for this nice piece of work. So my comments on this study are broadly 3 or 4 main comments I have. One is on the demand scenarios. The electricity is a very crucial sector due to the recent steep decline in cost of renewables, in particular solar. There is obviously talk about shifting other sectoral demand to electricity. So industry, for example, industrial decarbonization, we talk about electricity. Transportation, there's an obvious option in electric vehicles, which is being talked about. And now there is talk about hydrogen and green hydrogen all of these add to the electric power demand. And not just the gross demand, they also impact the shape of the load curve. So the current load curve, as we understand, with two peaks, one morning peak, one late evening peak, we don't know how that load curve will be, say, 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So I think that requires a bit of more detailed examination in terms of the impact of these various drivers on both gross demand as well as the shape of the load curve. Because I suppose the entire analysis depends upon the load curve. That's one comment on the demand scenario, sir. My second comment would be the GDP projections and the elasticity numbers. I think we probably might need to relook and you know this much better than I do, sir. You have been a member of the Planning Commission. The GDP projections of 8% year on year for next 10, 20 years, I don't know how realistic those assumptions are. Historically, what we have seen is because of various factors, growth does tend to be a bit lower. Of course, pandemic has really depressed growth in the last few years, but the GDP growth numbers year to year, probably we may need to take a look at that. That's one comment I have, sir, on the demand scenarios. The second comment, I was a bit struck
if I may clarify, we have 20 years of 8%, 20 years of 7%, and 20 years of 6% growth. So it's not just year to year 8%.
I noticed that, sir. Yeah, I noticed that.
Please go ahead. Sorry.
So the second thing, I was struck by the BAU scenario and the steep increase in fossil or coal plants, even in a BAU scenario. I was struck because some of the other studies I have seen, in a BAU scenario, the coal doesn't increase that much. And probably because as of now, the cost of coal is more than the cost of utility scale solar plants. So I was a bit surprised to see a large increase in coal in a BAU scenario. And moreover, recently the government position, the official position taken by the government or minister has said that India will not be building any more new coal power plants. So if I take that statement into consideration, then it was difficult to see BAU scenario having a large addition of coal-based capacity. That was my second comment, sir. Third, on the nuclear issue, it's a very contentious subject, and I would, it's a very hotly debated subject. On the one hand, in a country like India, every source of energy is important, whether energy saved or energy added, every kilowatt hour counts. Having said that, there has been an issue with nuclear power, which we have seen. Winfried rightly mentioned the issue of cost. And with notwithstanding what Dr. Kakotkar said, and with due respect to him, there has been an issue of costs with nuclear power. The light water reactors costs have been very high, what has been quoted in the newspapers. And you also have taken a number of around close to $4,000 a kilowatt, which makes it extremely expensive. The light water, the domestic heavy water reactors, those cost numbers are never open in the transparent, in the public domain. So we don't know what those true costs are. And so I suppose the number which you have taken, 50 or 60 gigawatts, looks reasonable to me, sir. If you are able to get to that much, I think it will be an achievement given our past track record. I recall when the Indo-US agreement was signed back in 2008, there was a lot of projections that nuclear will add this much by 2030, 40, but we really haven't done much in the last 13 years. And obviously there are some genuine reasons why we have not added. So I think that projection capping looks reasonable, and that's my view on nuclear. Yeah, that's right. that I would stop there. Yeah, the last comment would be on CCS. So I'm not sure if we, in a 2050 modeling scenario where we have policy projection or policy implications for the sector, how relevant it would be to take CCS into consideration for power sector. It's still to be proven, and we don't know how much capacity India has for CCS at an economic value. So thank you, sir, and I'll stop here with my comments.
Thank you very much, Anshu. Well, let me try and try and put together some of these things. In fact, we've had a very interesting session, listening both to the papers as well as the panel discussions. Essentially, what the paper has addressed is two issues: the technological transformation that we require in order to get to that state of net zero, and the economic challenge of that, particularly in terms of investment. I will not comment on that. There have been very interesting comments on that. One key one which has come out is how are you really going to treat nuclear? But that's, I will leave to IRADe to work out. What I would say is that on the technological side, we are counting a lot on CCS, on carbon capture and storage. Almost all the studies that I've seen require this. I think it is time we did a closer analysis of the economics of carbon capture and storage. As of today, we do not have a viable carbon capture and storage technology. Second, carbon storage. When you capture that, you'll have to store it somewhere. And do we have that geological capacity in India to store that carbon in a manner that it would not leak out? That has also not been investigated. I don't know the answer, but what I could say is not been investigated. On the second issue of the investment and finance, the scale of financing has been very well assessed in the study that was presented to us. I think we should start looking now at the dynamics of finance and how that will be, whether that will work in line with the direction of investment that you want. People invest because of profits, because of market considerations. And one of the challenges that we will face from a policy perspective, if you want that investment shift, which you're talking about in the study, will be how do I create those incentives? You are not going to get that shift of investment by regulation in today's environment. It will have to come from market incentives. And the key market incentive, which I'm sure countries will have to start looking at if they want this shift, is carbon pricing. And sooner or later, we'll have to start talking about carbon pricing, because without that, it's very difficult to see how the private sector, which does most of the investment, will shift in this direction. There are two issues that I think we need to explore a little bit more beyond the finance and the technology and the economic. One is the institutional challenge, that the energy system that we are looking at for 2050, 2060 requires an institutional structure for energy production and distribution, which is radically different from now. The highly centralizedly managed grid systems that we have are not necessarily the best systems when you're talking in terms of a decentralized renewable energy-based system. We have to revisit that. But apart from anything else in India, we also have to revisit the sheer viability of our economic system. You have the distribution cooperatives which are running, accumulating losses year after year after year, who are often reneging on their renewable energy purchase obligations and so on. One of the major challenges we will face in this is the resistance which will come from people stuck with stranded assets. This is certainly going to happen at the global level. I don't know how many of you have seen today's BBC story, which has leaked out the comments which have been received by IPCC, and how so many of those comments have essentially come from fossil fuel producing countries, including Norway, incidentally, fossil fuel producing countries, asking IPCC to tone down its target of a fossil fuel free energy economy. It has come out to it, but that's at the global level. But at the national level, we'll have the same problem, and in an even more vigorous way from people who are stuck with stranded assets in fossil fuels, particularly. And this is something that we will have to do. My final point that I want to raise is on the demand side. Much of what the discussions seem to take place on the supply side, and the only demand dimension that comes in is energy efficiency of appliances and so on. But we have to start addressing the nature of energy demand and whether we need to address that. Take, for instance, electric vehicles. We are assuming our main challenge is to substitute petrol-driven vehicles with electric vehicles and electricity coming from renewable sources, etc. But we could also ask the question, do we need so many vehicles in the country? Are there changes which may take place in urbanization with greater decentralization possible, which will allow us to reduce the demand for vehicles altogether? So it would not just be replacing fossil fuels with electricity, but overall reducing the demand for transportation using some of the new developments which are taking place in other areas of technology. And finally, let me mention something which is food. It is said about 25% of greenhouse gas, not just carbon, greenhouse gas emissions come from the food production system. 60% of that 25% comes from animal products. And half of those animal products are beef and lamb. So one of the demand challenges that we should face is asking people to become vegetarian, so that will bring down significantly the incidence of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you'll permit me, I will stop here because I have to go out for a climate change related dinner, which I'm already a little late for. And that will certainly be one where I will probably try and put the food challenge in effect. So thank you very much. And I will now hand it over back to Kirit. Thank you, Kirit. If you'll excuse me, I have to rush a little now. Okay.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you, everyone, for participating. There are many issues that has been raised which can be discussed further. For example, what you said is that, demand is very, very critical. In many of our other models, we have demand which is endogenous and which take care of all the different efficiency gains or ideas that one considers. We have also done a study on what will be the impact on the load pattern of, say, Delhi of electric vehicles, so that the load profile daily and weekend and weekdays load profiles can be worked out. And we can bring some of these into this analysis further to refine it in the way that Anshu said we should do it, and many other also suggested that. So I think, yes, they are very well taken point. Efficiencies, energy efficiency, how does it reflect in this other way, and what does it mean in terms of load profile when we make certain changes that we should like to bring it in. I think these are some of the major comments that I thought I will make some points about. I think Jyoti might want to conclude this.
We are also exchanging ideas on the side, on the chat. People are asking about energy efficiency. And I said that that's the first option, zero cost or low cost option, which is deducted first from the final demand. And so model demand is after the energy efficiency is accounted for. Of course, there are better ways to do this in a macroeconomic way, but that is not, this is only a technology model, and that's how we have done it. But within the group also, we were debating whether CCS is the right, let's say, call it technology tax, with so much, which has to bridge so much gap at so much cost. And then what are those technologies? Coal plus CCS is one, and also CO2 emission characteristics of that kind. And another possibility is hydrogen also. Right now, we have taken the view that hydrogen would be for non-electricity sector. But given $1 cost, and if also it requires further land for hydrogen, so I mean land for solar. So then what is the situation? So that this is not quite, I'd be quite happy to know more about this view, because we are ourselves debating coal plus CCS and hydrogen and maybe more nuclear. So four things together can handle this instead of just coal plus CCS. Or CCU may be much more where CO2 is actually utilized. So these are my comments, but let's have some more from the floor also. If you have, people can raise your hand or.
No, I can add one thing that, you know, in terms of this hydrogen, one can compare it with the storage cost of in hydrogen or storage cost in terms of batteries. And one might see which one turns out to be cheaper and we can explore that as well.
Yeah. So,
yeah, I come here briefly. Actually, in future, hydrogen in the long term will be generated green hydrogen and from the power system. So definitely power sector will have implication on the in terms of hydrogen, and we will look into this aspect sometime. Yeah.
Yeah, and I personally also not so much. I think maybe nuclear may be better than coal plus CCS. We don't know the dangers of CCS, and it's not really tried. I mean, it's jury is still out on on safety as well as you know, cost and many other grounds. It's not.
But if you see that the study carried out currently, like Nordic decarbonization study came out about a few weeks ago. IEA's decarbonization study for the China came out a few weeks ago. All consider CCS as one of the options.
Yeah, but gas-based CCS is another matter. I'm not talking about coal-based. Yeah, and they are doing offshore, no?
I would like to ask Dr.
Right.
Dam a question.
Yeah.
You know, where do you consider is a more danger, with nuclear or carbon capture and storage, where you know where the geological instability is there?
But that's both extremely dangerous. So what you do with nuclear waste, you need to store it safely for 1 million years. How old are we humans? Give it 10,000, 20,000 years. So we needed 20 times our human lifespan to save nuclear waste. And no one ever should be able to get to this nuclear waste. No terrorist in 10,000 years and so on.
No,
same is true for CO2 emissions. So if you press CO2 as a gas and if it would remain as a gas in the underground, see on this lake on Africa, it happened in 17 something. It came out once immediately and destroyed so many thousands of people and millions of animals. Nobody wants to take this risk. So from my perspective, forget both in the long run.
I prefer also lower economic growth and low energy consumption. But we have 5,000 kilowatt hour per capita, which is current global average for 2060.
I have a solution for nuclear waste, which would be that you launch it to the sun to crash there. Then it's more addition to the sun's nuclear energy in any way.
Did you make the energy calculation? How much energy you would need to send it up there?
Yeah, just have a nuclear rocket, a nuclear powered rocket, so that it only crashes there. Anyway, this is just a science fiction idea.
never a rocket.
European countries are skeptical to both CCS as well as nuclear, but the fact is availability factor of solar PV is 12% in Germany. Of course, you have wind offshore. Maybe that would be a large potential.
No, solar is so nice in India. You check
solar
Europe.
Availability factor of in Germany, that is about 12 to 13% annual availability of energy.
Yes, despite that, we are building so much of solar.
Yeah.
And the solar situation in India is so much better. You don't have 100 days of non-solar. You might have a few days of non-solar, but every day in India, somewhere is a lot of sun. So you only need to store the solar electricity for a night. What a beautiful situation India has.
Yeah.
Peter, you want to say something? Peter?
Yes, just from the point of view of the IEA, where as you all know, we look at this from an all fuels and all technologies situation, and clearly achieving net zero, you know, you can't start discounting technologies out of hand, you know, whether that's CCUS, whether that's hydrogen or nuclear, and in fact we discussed sort of new aspects to the nuclear question, such as small modular reactions. All these things should be on the table, right? And they all need to be assessed, as you rightly pointed out, and others have pointed out. The geological assessment has to happen. You know, there has to be a clear plan in place for sizing up the potential and the cost of these technologies. But just to say, I mean, you know, if we look at to sort of take CCS to one side and say, you know, it can play a lot of roles in the transition that electrification and electricity and solar generated power cannot, right? So there's a lot, you know, we often hear a common rallying cry to electrify everything, but there's just some parts of the energy system where electricity is not, you know, the first or the easiest solution. So, you know, in the net zero scenario that we have all fuels and all technologies that are clean coming through very strongly. And if we start to sort of exclude those, then we have to ramp up others to a much, much greater extent. And that's when we start to think through the implications on costs and the resilience of electricity systems as well. You know, the network needs, the battery needs, and others. So I'd just like to sort of add that as a potential counterpoint there to consider.
I just want to add here with Peter, you know, USDOE also has a similar policy, considering all options, be it CCS or be it nuclear. They are investing on a smart reactor research and small reactor development and all. Unlike Europe, I mean, USDOE considers all type of technologies.
Anyone else? Any more questions and so on? Since Nitin has left, I'm taking the role of coordinating, asking, moderating. If there are no more...
One quick comment on the small and modular reactor things. So there has been a lot of talk about it, but I'm not convinced about its relevance in the Indian context. One is that, you know, what the West is talking about as small and modular, India actually began with those size of reactors many years back. So the pressurized heavy water reactor which India developed, the CANDU ones, those actually were 110 megawatt reactors, which we began some 30, 40 years back. So the West is now talking about small modular reactors, which India actually has designed and developed many years back. That's point number one. Point number two is, that if at all we have to expand nuclear program, I would rather go for one integrated site with large capacity than distributing reactors all over the country. Given that India is a densely populated country, the challenges of acquiring land for nuclear reactors, we have to have the exclusion zone around the reactor, regardless of the capacity, and the challenges which Winfried talked about. So I'm not convinced if that is the way India would like to go forward if we want to expand the nuclear power program. I would much rather go with the current model where we are trying to pack in as much capacity in one single site. That would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I add with
one of the islands can be used for a large nuclear power plant. That
given India's population, India needs energy in bulk, you know. So these large reactors would be the solution rather than small modular reactors here and there. And keeping track on proliferation also becomes an issue when you have small SMR everywhere. And yeah, India is one of the designer of SMR long ago. But currently, I think because of still continuation of embargo, it does not have permission to sell those reactors in the market.
Well, we can go on like this, but I think maybe we should conclude at this stage unless there is one more pressing question or comment that anyone wants to make. I am restraining myself from making any comments on nuclear, but
no, I just said India is still not the member of NSG, Nuclear Suppliers Group, so it cannot sell, you know, reactor or nuclear technology.
So with this, I would like to thank all the panelists for really being with us, and this is a very lively and energetic session, and we'll continue to improve our report with this, but we wanted to do this before COP26 just to make sure, and we feel even more convinced that India can go out and say, here is our 2060 plan. Maybe it's not the way right now what it is, but in general, broad contours are such that we can say something definite. And that is the one thing we have learned from this. And second thing is that what kind of roughly technology mix and what is the technology X and what are the kind of characteristics it should have. And this debate has really clarified many thoughts. And I do hope that now somehow the climate is changing, climate of the climate debate in India. And maybe Prime Minister may announce something very positive. We don't know. He likes to doing surprising things. So thank you for being with us in this exciting journey. And our gratitude towards Shakti Foundation for supporting this work and for Anshu to be here. I apologize for being somewhat uncertain dates, and that's why we couldn't inform many people, but finally we decided it must be done before the COP26, even though we could do better job and more accurate job little later. We thought partial result upfront is better than more accurate results later for the time being. So thank you, and we hope to have continued contact with you and learn from you further facts on this matter.